Hello everyone, welcome to the first episode of History of Such and Forth, which is probably not going to be the actual title. I haven't really thought of a good title yet. By the time this gets posted, there will be a better title than that. I hope. Anyway, today's history lesson is on Japanese Buddhism. Japanese Buddhism is, like a huge part of Japanese culture, and has been since for basically ever ago. So let's talk a little bit about it then, shall we? Start at the beginning. During the Kohun period of Japan, which was from 250 to 538 AD, there were like a series of 5 monks that were from Gandhara, which is like an ancient kingdom near like modern Pakistan, and it was a center of Buddhist culture in the entire world at that period. Anyway, they went through China to Japan in 467 AD. It was at that point that they think that the first glimmers of like Japanese Buddhism had begun to sort of erupt in Japanese history, because those 5 monks from Gandhara came to Japan and began to sort of spread the good news of Buddhism, as it were. Moving on, the next bit of this is the Asuka period, which is from 538 AD to 710 AD, and the following Nara period from 710 AD to 794 AD. All these are AD, so I'm just not going to say AD anymore. But the official historical introduction of Buddhism to Japan is in 552 AD, when Song of Baekje, who was a king in Korea, yeah that's right, Korea sent it to Japan. This king had made Buddhism a state religion and was huge on Buddhism, so like all of the stuff that he did with other countries was completely based on Buddhism. Anyway, he sent a mission to Japan, where he sent like a bunch of monks, a couple like nuns, and just sort of said, alright, go to this place across the ocean and take care of it with Buddhism. So that sort of happened. After that, the like real spread of Buddhism, like the introduction to Buddhism being in 552, the spread of Buddhism was helped a great deal by Empress Suiko, who was the first female empress and one of the like Buddhist monarchs of Japan, who issued an edict called the Flourishing Three Treasures Edict, which essentially caused the entire country to become aware of this Buddhism thing that was happening. Or before she took like office as the empress, she actually took a vow to become a nun. So she is not only like a Buddhist nun, but also an empress. So ain't gonna have no sons there. The super powerful Soga clan back in old Japan there helped in solidifying Buddhism by being the first anyone to build a temple and put Buddhist relics in it. It's actually said that the first Buddhist relic that had come to Japan was a tooth that had belonged to the Buddha. And someone tried to destroy it one day, so they took this tooth and they put it on top of an anvil, and then they took a hammer and they hit the tooth, and the anvil shattered, and the hammer shattered, and the tooth was like, yeah, what up, I'm Buddha's tooth. So then the leader of the Soga clan at the time was like, take that tooth and any of the other like artifacts that we've got from Buddha and put them in a safe place so that people stop trying to break them and end up breaking all their shit. So they put them in the Asuka temple. That would be the Asuka period and the Nara period, really. Like, it is at this point that, like, Buddhism actually really starts in Japan, and where you get the, like, 6 main schools, sects, I guess, of Buddhism in Japan. I'm not going to list all 6 because they're really complicated and all that, but there are these 6 main ones, and they all center around the 2 capitals, Nara and Asuka. And so like these 2 places are super like hardcore getting Buddhist. But the issue with it was that Buddhism at this point wasn't really like a practical religion so much. It was for like highbrow priests and like all the super literate people and all that. Their job was basically to pray for the country because Buddhism was that way, and in order to use Buddhism you had to be able to read the sutras. In order to read you had to be literate, and most of the country was not. But a lot of people, that even though they weren't literate or anything, wanted to participate in the Buddhism as well. And that's where you got these sort of like hybrid Buddhist Taoist priests that were going on here. They sort of mixed a lot of the stuff from like the Buddhist tradition and the Taoist tradition and put in some of the like traditional shamanism that had been happening in the country as well. But you get those sort of people, and that's where this sort of split begins to happen between like the highbrow, like the super high echelon of Buddhism where you have to be able to read and all this stuff, and the sort of like people's Buddhism, I guess it would be called. Near the end of the Nara period is where the esoteric Buddhism sects sort of got introduced. So now there's those 6 like traditional sects, and then these 2 like sort of esoteric sects that are all part of one big Buddhism right now. So now you're starting to get the growth of Buddhism as like as an idea system. After that is the Heian period from 794 to 1185. During the Heian period, not a lot of stuff actually happened in terms of like revolutionary Buddhism things, but Shinto and Buddhism were made the main religions of the country. The capital was moved to Kyoto from Nara. I don't actually know what happened to Asuka being the capital, but I guess it probably just stopped. But in any case, it was during this point that a lot of the Buddhist temples and whatnot started gaining tons and tons of like influence on everyone else and were able to start becoming militant. So like you had Buddhist temples, and this is where like in the same sort of idea that you get back in China during those like movies that you'll always see, the wuxia movies, you'll get the like temple that's full of warrior monks that's super good at like you know, fighting and all that. That's what's happening here as well. At this point, the Buddhist temples here are simply militarizing themselves. And you can't really do anything to stop them because they're super powerful and they're the state religion at the time. So after 1185 and up to 1333 is the Kamakura period, which is the point where the sort of the like centralized emperor-based government kind of fell apart and the shogunates got introduced, and this is where like you get a lot of the samurai dramas and stuff. This is the Warring States period in here. And it is during here that the Pure Land school and the Zen schools of Buddhism arise, having come in from other places or being developed like on home soil and whatnot. And both of these are super quickly adopted by all the classes. Like the Zen Buddhism, which is all about meditation and being able to like free yourself from other stuff by yourself, that was adopted really quickly by the sort of like high-class, highbrow, okay, well we don't really want to, you know, have a ton of faith so much as we want to simply try to better ourselves kind of people. Whereas the Pure Land Buddhism is based primarily on faith and like the ability for the Buddha to save you as opposed to you saving yourself with like via the Buddha. That one was more of the whole like people's religion, I guess it was. Again, there's still that sort of like break between the high class and the lower class even in Buddhism. So then you get to the Muromachi period, which is from 1336 up until 1573. And this is where the Zen school, very specifically, like the Pure Land school and the Zen school were sort of like vying for power, but the Zen school managed to get the support of the sort of kind of faily kind of emperor, since the emperor wasn't really that important right at the time, but more importantly the Ashikaga shogunate, which is also called the Muromachi shogunate, hence the Muromachi period. The Muromachi shogunate was the one that was essentially the biggest at the time. They were the one that was kicking the most ass, and therefore they essentially were the ruling party in Japan right there. And the Zen people managed to get these people's support, and therefore they sort of skyrocketed in popularity. And then, you know, that's where you get this sort of like Zen Buddhism as a Japanese identity kind of thing that they've got going on. The next bit that we can talk about is the Azuchi Momoyaka period and the Edo period. And like the Azuchi Momoyaka period was from 1573 to 1600, not very long. And then the Edo period is from 1600 to 1868. And during the Azuchi Momoyaku period, this is at the end of the, like, Warring States period, essentially Oda Nobunaga kicked everyone else's asses and reunited the country completely. And so you have another united, single Japan at this point. It is at this point that Buddhism takes a huge hit, because Buddhism was super militarized at the time, was viewed as being, like, really strongly connected to the shoguns. And they didn't want anything to do with the shoguns anymore because that's what had been causing the Warring States period, and everyone was like, okay, we're done with this, we don't want to play with those guys anymore. Let's sort of step away from Buddhism a little bit. So Buddhism, their popularity sort of, like, took this huge down right at that point. And this is where, like, Japan's isolationism really began, was at the end of the Warring States period. Buddhism started getting highly regulated because of its military potential, because all the Buddhists that were still there were like, we want to be military, we want to go out and fight some more. And there really weren't any new Buddhist sects or belief systems or anything like that until during the Edo period. There was one, count it, one new sect that came out, and that was called the Obaku sect, or the Obaku line, who was made by a Chinese monk who'd come over to Japan after the fall of the Ming Dynasty, which was right around that period. I think it was the Ming Dynasty. I'm really bad at Chinese history. But basically this Buddhist monk comes over from China to Japan, and his Buddhism was the same branch that Zen Buddhism, like, Zen came to Japan and became Japanese Zen Buddhism. And then over here it was still kind of Zen Buddhism, but it was not Japanese Zen Buddhism. And so this monk came to Japan and was like, hey guys, what's up? Zen Buddhism, am I right? And they're like, I'm sorry, what are you talking about? Your Zen Buddhism is very strange and is not actually Zen Buddhism, because we know what Zen Buddhism is because it's a very, like, Japanese identity kind of thing right now. So we will accept your Buddhism, but we will not call it Zen Buddhism, we will call it a different thing. You are now the Obaku line of Buddhism. And the guy was like, I don't give a shit, whatever. That was where the Obaku line of Buddhism began. The next thing we have is the Meiji Restoration, which is from 1868 to 1912, which was a period of not just, like, let's move a little away from Buddhism, but it was an actively anti-Buddhist period of government there. In 1854, Japan was forced to end its isolationism thanks to the influence of the giant black warships that came in under the command of Commodore Perry. So that was 4 years before the Meiji Restoration. Then at the beginning of the Meiji Restoration, there was a government coup, and, like, all the current, like, government officials were booted out, and they put a new, like, government in completely right at that point. And they were super, super anti-Buddhist. And the reason for this was, again, like we mentioned before, the whole idea of the Warring States period having been so recently in the past, they wanted nothing to do with shoguns and daimyos that had been there. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with that. So they actually started a movement to kind of erase Buddhism from Japanese, like, culture and history whatsoever, and supplant it with Shinto instead. Shinto being, you know, the like, native Japanese religion, I guess, for lack of a better term. So, you know, they wanted to get rid of Buddhism, put in Shinto, and pretend like nothing happened. The other thing that really, like, took Buddhism out of the, like, main popularity wasn't that edict of trying to get rid of it. It was more that after the opening of Japan and the sort of, like, non-isolationist movement that they've got going on now, Japan said, okay, well, we're already open, and the other countries and stuff are more advanced than us. Why don't we see if we can't get a little bit of that, like, Western influence in here and see if we can't make our country grow faster and be a better country a little bit. At this point in time, the West, as seen by Buddhists, was like a force to be reckoned with, a force to contend with, not necessarily an enemy so much as just an adversary. And for the country to modernize itself by becoming more Western was essentially saying to the Buddhist sects, you gotta be okay with this or fuck off. Adapt or die, essentially. And so basically all of Buddhism was like, well, we don't really have a lot of chance for this, and it kind of got pushed to the wayside, except for Zen Buddhism, because Zen Buddhism is Zen Buddhism. They were like, yeah man, whatever, we'll go with the flow. They adapted to Western philosophy a little bit more, and it is because of that reason, and that reason specifically, that Zen Buddhism is the like still biggest sect of Buddhism in Japan right now, is because they didn't care. And they were more focused on internal stuff than external stuff, and so they said whatever comes on the outside, that's fine, because the internal stuff is what we're focusing on right now. After the Edict of April 1872, Buddhism itself became a secularized thing. The edict specifically stated that there are to be no more Buddhist-based laws in the state laws. Step 1. Step 2 is, Buddhist monks, you're not bound by those laws anymore because they're no longer laws, so you're allowed to get married, you're allowed to eat meat, you're allowed to have sex, you're allowed to drink. You can do all of these things, you can still be a Buddhist monk, but you are allowed to, you know, have a little bit more of a secularized life in order to sort of keep up with the modernization of the entire world at the time. And so Buddhists at that point had become completely secularized, and that's where Buddhism stopped being a real religion in Japan and just became a philosophy. And then the war started. During World War I there wasn't really a whole lot of Buddhist stuff happening, but World War II was where Japan's Buddhist monasteries, because they still had them, were done with this shit. So they said, we're Buddhists, and we militarized before, and we were good at it. Let's militarize the entire country again. Let's do all of this. Let's go out and let's bust some heads and let's kick some ass. And the government at this point was like, oh, okay, well we're all over that shit then. Cause we need to militarize and we want to be military. And you guys are going to help us do that, so you're in. And they passed this law that basically stated if you were against the war effort and you were in Japan, then you could be arrested. Which was perfect because that's what they used to get rid of the other Buddhists, the biggest lay Buddhist organization in the entire world, Soka Gakkai, which had been put together around that period. It consisted of like non-monk people, normal people that believed in Buddhism. And there's nothing wrong with believing in Buddhism, you know, of course, obviously. But these ones were the ones that were like highly anti-militaristic to the point of near violence, which is kind of weird. And ironic, I guess. But they were the people that were very, very strongly against the idea of being a militarized nation, because that's, you know, against the entire principle of being the Bodhisattva, the people who exist for the sole purpose of helping other people, even though they could have ascended a million years ago, that kind of thing. The Bodhisattva is a huge principle in Buddhism that people seem to have forgotten, but these people had not. But they weren't supporting the war effort, so Japan arrested all of them. Like, all of the leaders of this organization, the Soka Gakkai, basically got shipped off to prison and sat there. So Soka Gakkai's, membership plummeted, and nobody was really left to oppose the militarization of the country, and they militarized. Then the war ended, and people suddenly didn't give a shit about Buddhism, because it didn't really help at all. They kind of stepped further away from Buddhism even as a philosophy, because they realized that it wasn't really necessary for their spiritual enrichment anymore. Some people still do it, and that's fine, and you can do that if you want, but it's not necessary for the entire country to be doing it, which is where you get the idea of funeral Buddhism, which is the statement in Japan that you are born as a Shinto and die as a Buddhist. Because when you're born, they do the Shinto ritual for your birth and all that, and when you die, you are buried under the, Buddhist ritual for burial. And that's pretty much all that anyone really has to do with Buddhism anymore, nowadays. However, you remember that really large Buddhist organization that I mentioned a second ago, Soka Gakkai? After the war, all their leaders got let out of prison, and they got back together, and now that's another huge organization again. It's the biggest lay Buddhist organization in the world, and certainly the most diverse in America. They've got, sects of themselves basically everywhere. And they, in 2010, they had 8 million members or something like that. And that's quite a few people, actually, for following that sort of thing. The only issue with Soka Gakkai is that a lot of people use some very strong words to describe them. Words such as socialist or terrorist, even. Cult of personality is another, because the current leader of the Sokagaku organization is a very charismatic individual, and could very well turn around and say cult of personality time, and everyone would be like, yeah, okay, we're with you. I guess that's sort of where we are in the state of Buddhism right now. Buddhism isn't really a strong influence in Japanese culture anymore. It certainly exists, there is still the national, or rather the federal holiday, Obon, which is the Festival of the Dead, which is a Buddhist festival. And those still happen. There are still, shrines and temples to both, Shinto and Buddhism all over the place. And there are still monks that believe these things and, practice their sort of, modernized asceticism kind of thing. But it's not that big of a thing as it used to be anymore. Japan as a society has moved quite towards the secularization of their society, and only because Christianity and the Abrahamic religions have come in and tried to force everyone to believe what they believe, because that's what they're the best at, is forcing people to do stuff that they don't want to, is why Japan is sort of, religious at all. And that's the end of the brief history of Japanese Buddhism. I've left a lot of stuff out, I've left a lot of details out, because of course this is supposed to be a brief history and that's all that there's going to be of it. But if you have any questions about it, you can either ask me or look them up on the internet and look for yourself. I always advocate finding out more about stuff that you're interested in. Tell me what you want the next history of video to be. Put it in the comments or send me a message or do it on Twitter or something like that. You can contact me on Twitter, of course, at the handle which I'm going to put on the screen here-ish, probably. And then you can always send me a message here. Tell me what you want the next thing to be. It could be something as vague as music, or, folklore, or it could be something very specific, like electric lights, or the history of ramen, or something like that. You tell me what you want to see in this series, and I will see if I can't make it. Let's see you guys next time. Thanks for watching. Bye!